The Smiling Human podcast is made possible by listeners like you. If you would like to experience more of these shows into the future, then please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Hello, and welcome to The Smiling Human, where collectively we evolve through inquiry. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. My name is Oak, and I'm your host. Today, I'm speaking with Asher Walden. Asher Walden is the founder and director of the Empyrean Project, a project dedicated to exploring and teaching spiritual practices within the neurodivergent community. Dr. Walden has studied and published articles on Christian theology, East Asian philosophy, and the philosophy of the psychedelic experience. He devoted several years of his life to intensive meditation practice as a Zen Buddhist monk before returning to school to finish his doctorate. Asher now focuses on the Empyrean Project and on promoting mutual understanding between neurodivergent and neurotypical people through giving talks and through his blog, Spirituality on the Spectrum. It's not every day that I find a guest with whom I can share several hours of deep and meaningful conversation. Every now and again, I find someone whose interests align so beautifully with my own that, well, I'll let you in behind the scenes. He and I talked for more than just the hour you're going to hear here. In fact, we've almost doubled or tripled that by now. So regardless, today's talk is deep, insightful, and incredibly rich. And I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I did participating in it. Thanks so much. Fantastic. Well, Asher, thank you so much for being a part of the Smiling Human podcast. I am excited for our conversation today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited about it too.
Absolutely. So I'll ask you the question I ask every guest at the head of the show. What's the last thing that made you smile?
The last thing that made me smile, no doubt. Before this conversation with you, actually, was certainly my wife, who very consistently makes me smile.
You know, out of the 40-some episodes I've done now, the most consistent answer has been relationships.
I'm glad to hear that.
Or lovers or whomever. There's a real clarity coming through and a concise orbital center to this data that our relationships truly are what bring us the most meaning. So the audience would have got an introduction a little bit to your work and your background through the intro at the head of the show. However, I would love for you to flesh out some of the details as to the Empyrean deck in particular, but also just a little bit of history on how you came to this creation itself.
Okay, sure, I can do that. I was always interested in spirituality and religion, and I over the course of my life have studied different religious traditions and religious texts. I have a doctorate in theology, but it was technically in systematic theology. But what I really spent my time on was comparative religion, and thinking about how there's some academic questions, I guess, about how to put religions side by side, how to compare, what exactly are we comparing, and what's the point of such comparison, right? Are we just sort of looking at religions as sort of historical traditions, or in terms of ritual and art, or do we think, this is sort of the Minority Report, do we think that these religions have something useful and true to say about either the divine or about human nature or about how those two things fit together? So that was just stuff that I was always interested in, and I just wasn't really that interested in anything else, frankly. So I sort of had no choice but to study this stuff. I left. I had been teaching for about 10 years. And then I stopped teaching because I was sort of burnt out, and because I was really having a hard time figuring out how I fit within that sort of academic context. I really wasn't a good fit for a professional academic form of life. You have to be very specialized. You have to follow very specific kind of rules and values about what you publish and where you publish and how often you publish. right? And that stuff, I could sort of do it, but I wasn't. It really wasn't a good fit for me, like I said, and so I got sort of burnt out. And I always felt like I wanted to write something like a great work, right? I wanted to have a thing, I guess, that was my contribution to the study of theology and the study of religions. And I realized at some point that it wasn't going to be an academic text. If I ever succeeded in writing such a thing, I didn't want it to be something that only a handful of other academics would read. I wanted it to be something that would, I don't know, that would help people or something. So I stopped teaching, and I had a couple other jobs, and I didn't read that much for a couple of years. And then what happened just about 3 years ago, I guess, I started compiling a list of symbols. And I didn't really know what I was going to do with this list, but I knew that I wanted to get the list right. I wanted to kind of get a catalog, I guess, of what the most important central images were that sort of summarized and captured I guess, the human relationship with the sacred is maybe one way to put it. And so in this work, I was obviously I had all this background studying Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, Confucianism, Taoism. I knew a little bit about indigenous traditions. I know a little bit about Hinduism, but those are, maybe my weak places. And I did a little bit of catch up on Advaita Vedanta, which is sort of the trendy, which is the cool Hindu tradition amongst various other Hindu Orthodox traditions. So I don't know everything about everything, but I knew enough about enough different things and I had done enough sort of academic work in comparative categories, I guess. And most importantly, the kind of linchpin was Carl Jung, right? His idea of the archetypes. I was also interested in the particular way in which Joseph Campbell adopted that material, and I think to some extent Joseph Campbell was doing his own list, right? He had his his ideas about what those sort of elements were. And sometimes people ask the question, well, how many archetypes did Jung think there were? And I don't think there's a good answer to that. There was about a dozen that he talked a lot about, but he didn't have sort of a cataloging kind of Aristotelian mind. He was just kind of more exploratory in terms of how the archetypes worked and what they are. He wasn't. I'm not sure he would have thought that you could come up with a finite list that would capture all of them. But that's what I wanted to do. Basically, I wanted to capture a list, and like I said, I wanted it to be right. I wanted to make sure that I got that I was, that I wasn't just making this stuff up. That I had sort of good arguments and good sort of textual and historical bases for the ones that I chose. And so like I said, it's been about 3 years that I've been working on this list and organizing the list and structuring the list. And about, a little bit less than 3, maybe 2.5 years ago, I came upon the idea of the houses as a way of organizing this list, because I really did feel like they fell into kind of broader categories. And so it may be, so in the deck that I came up with, I actually have 66 cards. And so maybe there's 66 archetypes, or maybe not, give or take. But I guess another way to think about it would be to say that each of the houses represents sort of a big archetype or a great archetype. And then the different cards in the house sort of flesh out the elements or the parts of how that works. I think that that's a pretty good summary of kind of where I came from and how I arrived at the contents and the structure of the deck.
Yeah, fantastic. It's always such a privilege to converse with another who has what I imagine to be the level of respect and admiration for the greats like Campbell and Eliade and Jung, and recognizing that for each of them, they have reached into some element of human experience, be it through comparative religion or mythology or the depth psychology, and sort of brought forward relevant and applicable pieces into the human conversation, right? What is it that's actually going on? Who are we? What are we going to do about all the things that are happening to us? And this goal of yours, which when we first had our conversation put a really big smile on my face, where you're like, I wanted to get a concrete list that was right for all of these core things. It makes a lot of sense, because essentially what that appears to me to be, and why it appears to be so functional, is that when we work from the very broad to the very narrow, it's essentially a distillation process, right? Can we get closer and closer to a pure form of an icon, a symbol, an archetype, a narrative arc of sorts, what have you? And the clearer it becomes, should we be able to get there, the more universally applicable it becomes as well. And being able to take something like your list with the houses and the numerous different archetypes in them, to the listener, if you're curious, the links to the deck and all the archetypes will be in the show notes. We weren't going to go over them because we would have filled all the airtime with it, as much as I would have loved to do that as well. But we've got other good things to talk about. Essentially, distilling that down and then making it tangible. That was something that really captured my attention, where it's not just, like the stack of Campbell books on comparative mythology that I have on my bookshelf, where we would sit through and 1,000 pages later, maybe I understand something about the hero's journey or what it means to be born again or what have you. But now you have begun the process of materializing these archetypes and symbols into something that people can actually work with on their own. And so this brings me to one of the pillars I wanted to speak to you about, which is the function of these symbols and archetypes in one's own understanding of a spiritual path or their own place in life. I wonder if you can elucidate a bit about how you view that taking place with this.
Yeah, sure. Generally speaking, in terms of the use of the cards, I would say two. I guess that has sort of two parts. The first part simply has to do with learning the language of, I guess, the archetypes or these images, sort of getting familiar with kind of the visual and the what's the word? Just getting a lens, just getting sort of primed, I guess, to look for these kinds of things in your own life. So as you know, I've designed, I have the list and I turn it into cards, and I've come up with 3 or 4 different kinds of things that you can do with the deck, each of which is sort of fun for different people. If there's a card game, you can use it as like an oracle deck, like a tarot deck. There's also like a personality typing system that I've developed that I think works pretty well. But all those things are kind of a means to an end to kind of learn this language, to just get familiar with the idea of the archetypes, with the content of the archetypes, so that if you went and watched Star Wars again or reread Harry Potter or whatever, you'd be able to say, oh yeah, that's that, and it just sort of just lays it all out. Like these are sort of the elements, and these things should be pretty familiar.
Mm-hmm.
And so once you get, I guess, sort of attuned to that language, you start to see, oh yeah, this is where those patterns are. It's really we talked about this before, that for me, like one of my number one favorite keywords, I guess, is now pattern recognition. Right? There's something that's just so really, really human and really, really central about just being able to recognize a pattern when you see one. Right? That's like the whole thing for me right now. You see it here, you see it there, and you see it over there, and you say, aha, that's not coincidence, that's a pattern, right? And then once you sort of know what to look for, then you are not, you're not surprised by stuff so much anymore. So one way to think about what the archetypes are is to say that they're patterns. They're things that recur again and So the
This
other
is
half of it is once you sort of learn this language, you learn how to navigate change. This isn't something that we talked a whole lot about in our last conversation, but I've been thinking about. I've just been coming back to this again and again and again. What is spirituality about? What is religion about? What are these cards about? And one thing is that change is really hard for humans. We just don't like change. Change, it's disruptive, it's confusing. We often waste a lot of energy trying to figure out what's going to happen or where the pieces are. But if you know a pattern when you see one, then you sort of know what to expect. So in terms of the ultimate answer to the question, what are these cards for? I think the answer is navigating change. We are so risk averse. We are so afraid to change, right? This is why people stay in relationships that are abusive, why they stay in jobs that they hate, why they live in houses that they don't feel comfortable in anymore, right? We would always rather stick to, the devil, right? You know that expression, right? But people would always rather endure suffering that they know they can endure because it hasn't killed them yet, rather than take a risk to actually maybe find a form of life or a partner or a job or something that is less hurtful and less harmful and less bad. So we tend not to change when we should change, but even so, change happens to us. So again, think about what religions often do. Like a big part of it is rituals for birth, for coming of age, getting married, death, right? All those big life transitions. That's where we mark kind of sacred spaces, sacred places, right? We put a gate, or we do a ritual or something. And we say, well, this is how you navigate change. This is how you deal with change. And if you can do that, then your life's a lot easier, right?
Hmm. It appears to me that when one becomes more familiar with the archetypal language or the language of symbol, that we are increasing our fluency in this type of pattern recognition. And I want to expand on this just a bit to say that the pattern recognition that is taking place is as such that it clarifies the quality of our experience such that we are more capable of deriving meaning. It's almost as though we could imagine ourselves awash in a sea of information. We obviously are, but sense information more so, patterns of relationships, behaviors, and happenings. Most of it doesn't make sense to us. Most of it doesn't make sense because we don't need it to make sense. It's not necessarily applicable or useful. But with the continued exposure towards the very real, substantial, and I would say inherent nature of symbology and the archetypes, what starts to happen is that these pieces that might have otherwise been ignored now coalesce into a point that is not isolated and is meaning rich. So something forms, something actually starts to take shape in our perception of the world that actually has branches out. So it's not just this sea of chaos, but we have a distillation. And when we have those branches, just like you're saying, the capacity to navigate change is facilitated with greater ease. Because you go, okay, if I see this one often occurs with these other pieces. In fact, it only ever occurs with these other pieces because it's a part of a tapestry or mosaic. Okay, so if I'm seeing this, now I know to look for this piece and that piece and this piece. Each of those has branches deeper into the psyche, deeper into our own understanding of self, and can equip us, just like you're saying, if I'm parroting, forgive me, but I really think it's a true and meaningful point. It equips us by giving us almost a menu of actionable options. If I know I'm at a death phase, per se, in the hero's journey, if we want to go back to Campbell, then I'm looking at releasing, letting go, surrender. I'm looking at the willful opposition inside myself to this change. That's going to be the highlight. But if I'm at the triumphant return home, I'm going to be more attuned to the gold that I have retrieved. How am I integrating that? How am I bringing it back to my community through my thoughts, words, and actions? The focus shifts because we are able to qualify the different aspects of our experience through this lens and language of archetype and symbol.
Yeah, a lot of it just is kind of separating the signal from the noise, isn't it? Right? There's so, just like you said, there's so much information, so much kind of data that we're just being engulfed by in terms of, not just kind of perceptual in the sense of the five external senses, but emotional data, social data, the data of our own desires and needs and hungers, and so just part of what it means to be human is just sort of kind of whittling all that stuff down to what's important, what's meaningful, what's actionable, what do I really want versus what are the things that I think I'm supposed to want, right? And so the one of the ways in which this kind of archetypal thinking is helpful is that it gives us kind of very simple, clear categories to say, well, these are the kinds of things that might be going on. These are your options, right? It's not like a million abstract possibilities. It's like four, right? You have four possibilities of like what it is, and when we can get that number down, then you can say, okay, well, actually, this is what's going on, and that and that's how we make meaning, right? Is we organize data in a certain way so that we can tell a story, right? So that we can give kind of a history of where we've been, why we're experiencing what we're experiencing now, and where we want to go, and then we can start to think about what our options actually are in terms of practical steps, or sometimes it's not practical steps. Sometimes it's sheer acceptance of the inevitability of death, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, two pieces float to the surface that I think are relevant to introduce to the conversation now. One is that the archetypes, as they show up, using your cards as an example, the symbols themselves and the meaning of these archetypes are not dictatorial. It's not like when we pull them forward and go, okay, I'm seeing, the tyrant and Mother Earth, that is the end all be all, whatever the descriptions of those might be. They're loose enough, and I mean that in not a denigrating way at all, but they're loose enough insofar as there's room for interpretation and almost a soul seeking in relationship to the symbol. When it arises, it's like, where is the resonance? I don't need to conform to, but I am opening up a container wherein the natural resonance of this archetype in my own life, in my own psyche, is welcomed. It's evoked through, right? So that's one element. And the other piece that I want to name, because I anticipate some people might have the same experience that I did, is the idea that archetypes or symbols or icons are universal, and that we might have a meaningful trajectory of, like you took, to distill them out of these religions around the world. It can be a bit confronting. The idea that if I'm not Buddhist or Hindu or Confucian or Muslim or whatever, that the icons, symbols, and archetypes in those great myths, stories, and histories are somehow applicable to me might cause a bit of dissonance. But what I want to speak to is that the fact that we can sit here and say, across all of the world's religions, just as Campbell did, and mythologies, we see the same things coming out. This is not an opinion. This is anthropological and historical fact, right? If we can read and we can recognize symbols, we see that they come forward in a very patterned and meaningful way. And rather than being reductive or confining, I want to offer the idea to the listener that this is actually incredibly empowering, because now we are no longer adrift in a sea of this meaningless overstimulation. that in fact there is something that transcends our own personhood per se, that can allow us to be more capable and competent in the kind of meaning making that would alleviate our suffering, bring us to a more purposeful life and a greater understanding of what it means to be human.
Yeah, it's really tough, you know. I I mean, there's you know, we're coming out of an era. We're at the tail end or in a transitional time where we're coming out of an era where people are really skeptical of grand narratives, skeptical of the idea of human nature, skeptical of the idea that there's some set of rules or set of patterns or some kind of religious view that sort of its nature ought to be true of all humans, right? I think we sort of recoil against that idea. And yet, on the other hand, you know, Jung was a medical professional, right? I mean, there's some, you know, there's some advantage to saying, well, there's advantage to knowing this is how humans work, right? And it may not be exactly true for every single person, right? Obviously, there's differences, there's cognitive differences, there's physical differences. There's you know, we want to be able to sort of have a place to talk about those as well. But the only way to make sense of those differences is to have a sense of sort of the whole, I guess. How is it that humans function? How is it that humans make meaning of the world and of their experience, right? And if human brains are more or less similar, or at least similar in these respects, then the ways we experience the world ought to be similar. Moreover, and this is sort of the next step, if you think that humans' experience is ultimately based on or has to have some relationship to the empirical, objective, external world, you know, that's not just something we make up, right? And again, this is this thing that people are sort of stuck on or feel it sort of sticky, right? Is this something that we're just sort of making up because it makes sense to us? Like, sort of ask this about religion in general, right? Is something that we're making up because it works or because it has some kind of objective bearing in the world as it is? And so this idea that the archetypes should be empirical, right? The idea that we find these images not just showing up again and again, but showing up in sort of the same ways across different religious traditions, in not just the so-called great traditions or the book traditions, but also indigenous traditions. See some similar things, and just see it in people's dreams, see it in, you know, movies and television, and, you know, they just sort of come up. So that's, you know, it's just worth you know, like I said, I know a pattern when I see one, right? So it's worth investigating.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, figuring out, you know, figuring out how that works, you know, empirically, psychologically, politically, right? If we're concerned about imperialism and that sort of thing, we have to be sort of careful.
Mm-hmm. Well, it brings to mind the distinction between analytical and analogical thinking. And this is something that I first encountered when I was reading the collected works of Carl Jung, titled Dreams. And he was speaking to how if we use, like, each has its own realm. So analogical has its own realm, analytical has its own realm. And when we're speaking about the sense perception and how we operate within this objective external world, and I use that lightly, we talked about Advaita. So there's, when we get
Right.
really down to the roots of things, questions start to come up. But anyways, that's where we use the analytical. This is the linear, this is the rational, this is the causal thinking that allows us to have trains run on time, allow this technology to function, allows all of the things that constitute, we might say, Western human scientific rational understanding to be made possible. Analogical, on the other hand, is the language and understanding of symbol, of relationship. And he says that when we're dealing with the unconscious, or we're dealing with the subjective nature of the human psyche as it pertains to the archetypal, as it pertains to the symbolic, we cannot and ought not use analytical thinking. It does not work. We cannot apply the same kind of logic that would support us in algebra to the interpretation of dreams. It's folly. What we can do, on the other hand, is recognize that there's this sort of fluid enmeshment of these types of symbols that are the inhabitants of the subjective realm, and recognize that meaning and knowledge can be derived from the relationship between symbols. From, A is not B, but A means B in this situation only, inside the subjective and mysterious realm of human consciousness. And I think that that's a really important thing to realize, is that the consequence, I'll name one more thing, the consequence that Jung said about putting one form of thinking into the other. So if we apply analytical to the unconscious, we completely miss the point. We have reduced our human complexity to mechanical moving parts, and we don't actually get to this rich meaning making and communion with the self. If we use analogical on the external and objective world, this is where we fall into the trap of magical thinking, where everything has a meaning and everything's a sign and it's all synchronistic, and we sort of get these grandiose delusions of it's solipsistic in a sense, but it's almost hyperactive main character energy. And it can be quite deleterious to relationships and to one's psychological stability. And so there's a really fine line that needs to be walked between understanding that there is a bridge between the internal and the external. And this is what Jung called psychoid phenomena, when there's a mirroring, an appearance of something that is internal and external, and it's an undeniable coincidence in, to put firm terms on it. And that, I think, is the doorway that you're speaking to, in some sense, that you brought up earlier, Asher, of these thresholds, the sort of sacred space thresholds. We get glimpses into the underlying luminous and numinous nature of reality when we recognize that they are separate, but they're not as separate as we think.
Right. So one thing that I've been thinking a lot about lately is the habit of sort of dividing the world up into two parts versus dividing up the world into three parts. So what that means in my kind of traditions of thought is the idea that on the one hand, there's, like our kind of private subjective experience of the world, right? How we experience it, how our brains produce kind of an imaginary goldfish tank, I guess, of what of subjective experience versus the real thing, right? Whatever is kind of objectively true, which is, what we analytically want to say is the cause or the source of whatever it is that we subjectively experience. And anybody who's familiar with the philosophical tradition, either East or West, knows that never works. It always breaks down, right? If you divide the world into those kind of simple terms, you get paradoxes and you get problems, and you really end up with skepticism. And I think that kind of interpretation of Kant, that interpretation of sort of the modernist project is part of what led to a lot of the problems in postmodernism and relativism and blah, 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 blah. On the other hand, there's a system that actually has some pretty good foundations, again, both East and West, which is kind of a three-part division, or a three-way way of thinking about it. So again, starting with our kind of subjective experience of the world, what we see, what we hear, but also our emotional life, our analytic understanding of our desires and our situation. And there is that other realm, which is sort of brute reality in and of itself. But all the interesting stuff happens in that third realm, which is right in between them. Right? If you select out just those, and this is what the unconscious is, right? If you select out just those parts, those mechanisms, those processes, chemical reactions, all those kind of objective things that are going on in sort of the Kantian thing itself, the world as it is, that are directly responsible or directly related to how we produce or how we experience or how we arrive at our subjective experience. That's where all the action is. And it turns out that this world, it's not just like a gray area. It's not just the place where the two worlds meet. It's a big area. There's a lot of space there. There's a lot of stuff going on. And that's where, that seems to be where the archetypes live. That seems to be where it seems to be the source of like real insight, real transformation in human life. That there are these places where we think the world is one way, right? There's a certain relationship, there's a certain arc, I guess, of how we kind of how the conscious mind, I guess, sort of interacts with the real world, whatever that is. And in that space, there's a lot of different things that can go wrong, but there's also a lot of there's a lot of sort of self-correcting mechanisms, I guess. There's a lot of ways in which when things get caught, when things get stuck, the energy builds up, and then it keeps on building up until either something breaks, and kind of unconscious forces sort of spill out messily and destructively into our experienced world, or less destructively, those energies are kind of self-correcting, right? There are patterns, there are operations and spirits that are fundamentally friendly to the human condition, to the human project, right? Human life isn't just like an alien on a rock in space, right? Human life is contained, held, protected, fed, nurtured, supported by all of these energies that are out there in the world, that are objectively in the world, that feed into our bodies, the microbiome, with all the bacteria that lives in our guts, the very nature of light that makes it amenable to optic translation, right, and presentation. The world is sort of, at some point, the world became really, really friendly to humans, like really, really seemed to have something on the line that really wanted humans to happen and to live and to thrive. And I think that those energies are still with us. I mean, we still, we're shooting ourselves in both feet every step we take, but the kind of fundamental forces, I guess, the energies of the planet, nature are with us and are sort of on our side, actually. So for me, that third realm, that realm of the unconscious is where all of those spirits live. Again, spirits of things that can go wrong, of cognitive error, of prejudice and illusions of various kinds. They can crop up, but that's also and then we see the results of those in our conscious life. But if we sort of turn back our attention to where those things are coming from, there's a lot of resources available that we can sort of tune to, and that we can help.
Beautiful. On the coattails of that deeply insightful share, Asher will take a short break and we'll come back with the second half of the show. I hope you're enjoying the show so far. I wanted to take a brief moment to talk about just how you can help this show grow into the future. Did you know that we have an Instagram, a YouTube, and a Patreon? Probably. But if you're listening on YouTube, like many of you are, I would invite you to subscribe, to like this video if you've enjoyed it, and to leave a comment. Let me know what you thought. Let me know if you have any questions or maybe guests that you want me to interview. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple Music or any other podcast platform, then please take this moment to rate the show. All of these actions go a long way to helping the Smiling Human podcast reach more people and grow into the future. Thank you so much. Alrighty, we are now back with the second half of the show, which means we are into the section called the Question of the Week. This is where I invite our guests to bring forward an inquiry, a question, or something meaningful to them that they think maybe they want my opinion on. Maybe it's going to be helpful for you, the listeners, to hear us talk about. So, Asher, what have you got for us this week?
Sure. Generally speaking, my question is about the archetypes and about the usefulness of this way of thinking. And in particular, I've been trying to figure out a way to do some empirical research on the efficacy of thinking in terms of the archetypes, I guess. So the way I'm sort of summarizing it is if we were to set up a research study, if I were to kind of write up a proposal and seek grant funding and to show that this model of thinking gets something right, how would I do that? And what would be sort of the research questions? Is that a good place to start, or should I get
Yeah.
should we get more specific?
I think as we go back and forth, the specificity will arise naturally. What I imagine is some clarification in terms of the audience at hand, right? So if you handed them over to me, if I was a part of the research experiment, you're putting them into the hands of someone who is intimately familiar with the works of Jung and Campbell and Eliade and Michael Meade and Robert Moore. And so my immediate accessibility to the nature of these symbols and the interplay of them would be, I assume, probably much greater than the average human being. And so what I would do if I were you, and we can play with this, is I would have that be one of the qualifying questions to say, what is your familiarity with divination practices? With maybe it's tarot, maybe it's casting runes, maybe it's other forms of divination. What are your familiarity with symbols and myth and archetype? And start to get a sense that way when we hand the cards over and we can talk about what the experiment might look like or could look like, we can categorize the self-reported experience based on familiarity and might be able to track those as variables. And that could be a helpful piece. The other piece that I think is important is the methodology. What are we asking them to do with it? Is there a rigorous structure, or are we allowing more of a subjective interpretive engagement to take place? And the reason I bring that up is because for someone who is familiar with divination or the exploration of these types of insight practices, we might say, the meaning that they derive, again, will be more immediately accessible because they are tuned into that threshold that you spoke about in just at the end of the first half, right? In the tripartite understanding of reality, the in-between of what is inner and outer. And so if we're handing them over to people who have never done anything like this before, I think structure would be necessary. And what that structure looks like, I think I would leave that up to you, having crafted it. But those would be the metrics I would look at: familiarity with the archetypes, familiarity with divination practices, as well as how we expect them to use it. And then when we have those two, we can go, what are we measuring afterwards?
Yeah. My hope for the cards is that it would provide a way into this way of thinking that might not be accessible to people otherwise. So, for example, well, let me say two things about it. One is that when I was coming up with the deck and I was putting together the product, at one point, one idea I had was to sell the cards just by themselves. No guidebook, no rules, no text, no guidance. And my idea was, and this might work for some of the cards better than others. My idea was if I chose the cards carefully and correctly, and I had kind of very, very simple, kind of bland images. So I'll show you. So one example is garden. The idea of a garden, and this is like clip art. This is not great, inspiring artwork here. It looks like a farm with a house and some fields, right? So it's very, very bland. But my idea was if you heard the word garden, just hear the word, and maybe, for people who are visual learners, you just see a picture of a garden and there's, crops and food growing. That's all you know about it. My thought was, or my fantasy, I guess, was that would be enough. That you wouldn't need any explanation, or you wouldn't need anyone to tell you what a garden means or what a garden represents, or the roles of gardens in the biblical text or in other stories, or in soap operas, or you kind of know what a garden is, right? You have if you've ever been to a garden, or ever heard of it, ever seen uh, uh, people in, I don't know, Pride and Prejudice, and they're strolling through the garden, you kind of already know what a garden is, right? And what you were saying was, well, you already have familiarity, right? You and I have both read a lot of Jung. We've read Joseph, we've read all this stuff, right? Well, what if it turned out that, maybe you and I don't need cards like this? Maybe on some way we're sort of, or we're kind of attuned in a way that we think we understand that third realm, the other world, the realm of the spirits, the realm of the fae, the dream world. We understand that world is in some respect real, and that world is the foundation, I guess, of our conscious lives. We sort of get that. The question is, if someone had no prior experience of the tarot, if someone had no prior experience of Jung, if someone had no prior experience of a particular religious tradition, or a particular neo-pagan or alchemical tradition, is there some way in which a very simple deck of cards like this that they just sort of play with, that would in some sense convey the same information? Does that make sense?
It
That
does, and
that
and I notice myself dubious to say yes, because of the cultural impoverishment of symbolic literacy,
Mhm.
and the absolute illiteracy in analogical thinking for most people. And so immediately while I was listening to you, I was thinking, okay, for someone who would go, well, a garden is where you grow food, and that's the extent of it, we're going to miss some. That's a fairly low resolution understanding of the symbol and the icon. And so what can we do to bring people into the process of multi-vector associative thinking, if that's even a term that might work?
And
And
it may
word
not be that.
association came to mind.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is where we get back to the other question. What are we going to have? Obviously, it's not going to be enough just to hand them a deck of cards and say, look at them, or
Yeah.
read them, right? There's got to be some kind of engagement that that helps them enter into that story realm, the realm of the suspension of disbelief, right? I don't think it's that hard for people to, I mean, this is where I think musicals are so effective. Like I'm sort of skeptical. I think musicals are sort of ridiculous, right? And yet, when I watch a musical, I'm like crying, right? Like bawling my eyelid, right? Because there's something about the fact that it's music that sort of tricks your brain almost, that shifts your brain by, through no conscious choice, right? Through no intention, your brain sort of moves out of the analytic and into the analogical, right? Your brain moves, like when someone tells you the rules of a game, right? If it's Monopoly, if it's Risk, you don't ever stop to think, well, is this a good representation of reality? Or do these rules make sense? Or you don't even ask if it's going to be fun. You just sort of assume that it will be, and you jump right in. And that's sort of what I want, right? I want to set up a situation where people sort of jump right in. And then what happens is, instead of sort of looking down at a card like garden and analyzing it and say, well, this is what a garden is, and this is how it works, people sort of imaginatively enter into the garden. And as soon as you do that, something happens. This is, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but this is the idea behind the Ignatian spiritual exercises. You familiar with? Okay, so this is the founder of the Jesuit order within the Catholic Church was a guy who who became known as Saint Ignatius. And he basically developed this technique. It's basically a development of the tradition of lectio, where you take a biblical text and you reflect on it, you meditate on it. And what he said is, well, and I guess the preamble is that this is a guy who liked to read literature and like like not even great, like cheesy romances. He liked to read a lot. So he had this insight and developed this technique where if you took a text from the Bible or a scene from the life of Jesus, and you entered into it imaginatively. It's called imaginative prayer. You just imagine what it would have been like to be there, right? This is not the historical Jesus. This is nothing theological. This is just, well, here's a story. What would it be like? And this is what we do, right? This is exactly what we do when we read Lord of the Rings or anytime we watch a movie. Imaginatively, we enter into this other world. And in this other world, the patterns are real and the specifics and the history is secondary, it doesn't matter. So one way or the other, I think that's what I want. I think that's sort of the goal, right? To set up either through readings or the game or whatever else we do, just to set up a very simple technique where people imaginatively enter into this garden, right, through their own memories of being in a garden and kind of reliving those memories, or through thinking about movies they've seen, or a biblical text even. Sure, why not? Couldn't hurt. Whatever it is, to kind of enter into it. And the idea is that, and this is sort of the Ignatian idea, that something transformative happens. That when you enter this space, your kind of analytic, kind of rational ideas about how the world works, about what you want to happen, about your control, I guess, over the world, these things don't like collapse, they don't break down in a kind of schizophrenic or psychotic break, right? There's just things get soft, things get a little bit more malleable, you get a little bit more plastic in your thinking about things. And I think that's all I want, right? I want to create a system in which it's easy and very, very low risk for people to enter this imaginative space without feeling like they're going to be tricked or manipulated or evangelized, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's just these images. Go in and play with them and sort of see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. How does one encourage analogical, associative, and playful thought? That's, I think, one of the key pieces when we're speaking about the imagination that you brought forward with St. Ignatius. What we're doing is the suspension of reality as it is essentially turns off the default mode network. We are entering into a novel and unknown territory, which is far more proximal to the unconscious than anything else that we are regularly exposed to, we could say.
Right.
And so if we're thinking in terms of a deck of cards and the efficacy at opening up the doorways for people in themselves to allow their natural archetypal literacy to blossom, then what underlies the game structure side of these cards, in my view, and you can tell me what you think of this, needs to be something that actively encourages through gameplay this type of analogical thinking. So as an example, I don't know the name of the game. It's something I saw on Instagram. It's like you go around and you have to say a series of words associated with something. So someone will say like lawn chair, right? Okay. And as quickly as you can around the circle, you have to say a word associated with lawn chair that's relatively congruous. And the first person to stumble, okay, they lose, they're out of the game, right?
Sure.
That kind of word association, I think, works really well with these symbolic and archetypal icons, because that is exactly what we're trying to get people to recognize, is that every single one of these symbols has all of these. They serve as a node. These archetypal and symbolic icons serve as nodes, nodal points of information and wise reference such that when we connect with them, we can more wisely interpret the data of other nodal points or the narrative we find ourselves ensconced in. So encouraging this type of analogical thought, I think, is core to ensuring the efficacy of these cards.
Sure. I mean, that would be easy to do. I mean, start off with, each card has, a word, a name or a keyword, and you could just have each person sort of write a list. And, when you hear a garden, what are the first 10 things that you think of? And you just think about it and you just sort of write them down. It would be simple. I'm not sure it would be all that entertaining,
Right.
but
well, we have to gamify it.
right.
We have to, and this is what will support the fortification of those analogical circuits. We have to reward them for doing it. And for those of us who are maybe obsessive about self-understanding and the mysteries of life and theology and philosophy, the reward is knowledge itself, right? But when we step into a game or we step into contact with what might be our first exposure to these archetypes, we need some sort of positive feedback. Right? Okay, well, I want to be able to make as many words as possible, or I'm going to get kicked out of the round. So maybe instead of writing a list, now we have to go around and say it, right? Maybe somebody is in the recording position. Okay, Mark said fecundity. Good word, Mark. Mary said soil. Stephen said greenery. Great. Okay, so now we've got all these different things, right? Blooming, seasons, whatever, all these stuff. And then you look at it at the end and go, okay, this is the basin of analogical and associative ideas that populate the node of garden as such, right? You do that for a few of them or all of them if you want to, because hell yeah. And then next time when you're actually playing it or you're doing a different form of it, now you've got not just the 57, but you've got 57 plus 8 associative words for each of them. So we've increased the resolution 8-fold, essentially.
Yeah, I think this is one of the reasons why the kind of divination aspect is so helpful. When you're, because the idea of treating the cards like an oracle, like a tarot deck, is that you play a card in a certain context and you give maybe a handful of things that it could mean. You say, well, this card sometimes represents this, sometimes represents this, and usually the person who's doing the reading will sort of feed some suggestions. And then what the person who's, I guess the reading is for, the querent, has to figure out, well, how does that actually apply to my life? I think that part is really, really important. It's not just about, think of every word that could be relevant. There's some clarification, I guess, or honing in, detecting which of those connotations, I guess, actually has some resonance, right? Given what I'm actually going through in my life, given the problems I have, which one of those things is actually, which one of those words actually works as an interpretation or as an insight or sheds some light on whatever it is I'm actually going through or whatever question I actually have. So that's that. I mean, I would think that just doing word association can still be sort of analytic in the sense that it's sort of abstract. It's outside of your life, right? You can say, well, you don't come up with a thesaurus, right? You can say, well, these are all the other things that this word, or other words that kind of sort of mean the same thing, right? But that doesn't help us, right? That's not quite what we're going for. What we want is for people to make the connection, to sort of see the relationship between what's going on in the cards or what's going on in the archetypes or what's going on in the movie with their own life. And I think that's really, I think that's a real problem we have in our culture. It's not that we have any shortage of archetypes. It's not that we have any shortage of really good movies and really good books. It's that people think of these things as entertainment, right? They say, I'm going to go into this world. I'm going to have this kind of roller coaster ride of an experience. And then when I leave the movie theater or whatever, it's just my life again. And so we miss that catharsis, right? We miss that kind of that potential for transformation, for insight, for maybe some kind of emotional processing, for all the things that kind of religious experience is supposed to be able to provide us with,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What comes to mind is a few things, as usual. The first being that there's a minimum threshold for connotations before resonance can be detected. That is to say that if we don't have any associations with a symbol or word,
True.
how are we going to be able to find where it plugs in, right? It might be immediately obvious. And so I agree with you that we can do this type of word association, first word, best word kind of idea, and still remain detached and non-immersed. However, I think that that kind of practice, even as just a daily thing, what do I think of when I think of hats? Okay, all these different things, right? What it does is it starts to populate different touch points or like nodal hooks. I'm making these little hooks with my hands for the listeners who are not watching on YouTube. Grab points where we're not just rolling a smooth ball on marble, but there's actually somewhere for something to grab, make contact, and fuse, connect in a meaningful way that actually elicits, evokes, or illuminates something that is real about what it means to be this particular person.
Yeah, and
And
that would
so,
be the
mhm.
yeah that would be the empirical piece too. That's something that ought to be measurable, right? That if I ask you, to reflect on hats, I'm not expecting you to have. It'd be sort of surprising if you had, you suddenly broke down in tears and had some insight about your life because you were thinking about hats. But that could happen if you're thinking about a garden, right? And this is sort of, again, sort of part of the idea of the archetypes, that these images, just by themselves, have, just because of the way humans function, just because of the way the mind works, because of the ways in which we typically process and interpret data from the external world, but also from our own emotional life, our relationships, that there's something important about a garden or the mother, right? Or the idea of a father, or the idea of, like, I can't think of anything that's really important about your uncle, right? There's probably nothing dramatic is going to happen for most people if you think about the idea of an uncle. At least not in our culture. Maybe some other cultures, the uncle had. I think there are other cultures in which the uncle has sort of important family responsibilities as such. But then you say, well, what is that responsibility? Is it as a teacher or a guide? Is it as a kind of ersatz father? Is it, what is it? But the idea, I think, or at least part of the idea of the archetypes, is that there are these concepts that act as, like you say, hooks, that they have that for us, they have this sort of intrinsic energy, this kind of intrinsic depth that, when you're scanning along different words, it's sort of like, the game hot or cold, right? You start to get warmer, 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 and when and it may be that there's no one word in English or whatever language you're speaking that exactly corresponds, right? And there's always, I think we talked about this before, that there's always a difference between an archetypal image or a name of the archetype, or a particular incarnation, I guess, of an archetype, versus the archetype in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Because strictly speaking, the archetype in and of itself is part of that, the world in itself that we sort of by definition never touch, never experience, never know directly. But we know it indirectly through the structure of the archetypes, right? And we can do some kind of pattern recognition there.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, just finding those things that, and of course, the other part of it is, even if we have a list of which ones tend to be important for humans in general, that doesn't mean that they're all going to be relevant for where you are in your life. And it's that transitions thing. That when you're going through a hard time, or you have a puzzle, you have a nut that you just can't crack, when you have, a relationship at work, or your relationship with your spouse, or, something where you're like, there's something going on at a particular time of your life for which one of those archetypes is going to be the lever, right? It's going to be the tool that sort of cracks the thing open, and then you suddenly see, oh, this is why I'm having such a hard time with this. This is why this thing is sort of making me miserable, or this is why this thing is so important to me, right? Sometimes there's things that we love and enjoy and value, but we don't really understand why it's so important to us, right? And so if we're simply going on kind of an analysis of cause and effect and life story, we may not really scratch under the surface. We may not understand for ourselves why we want what we want, or why we value what we value. But if we can kind of tap into these kind of intrinsically valuable events or structures in the human mind, then that can shed light. Well, of course, right? Your relationship with your mother is important. It's important for everybody, right? It may not be what you're kind of figuring out right now in this time of your life, but if it is, then kind of seeing some of the connotations and seeing some of the relationships around that archetype can be transformative.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The greater we connect in with what is essential to our being, perhaps the easier it becomes to move through these kinds of transitions. For those listeners who are excited and curious about the idea of an archetypal deck, being able to engage with these in their own lives and being able to leverage them for their own personal growth, Asher, where can they find you?
Sure. So the main spot right now is my landing page, which is empyreanproject.com. There's some introductory descriptions of the deck and the Empyrean project more generally. It connects to my blog, which I've started only relatively recently, but I'm doing some material. That my blog is called Spirituality on the Spectrum, and it's sort of key to my experience as a neurodivergent person, thinking about spirituality, and I generally would not say that this deck is designed for neurodivergent people or autistic people, but I would say that it's designed from an autistic perspective, I guess. That anyone who's autistic themselves or kind of understands what that's about will see, oh yeah, this is sort of an autistic way of thinking about religion and spirituality, right? Because it's just about the patterns, it's just about sort of the logic of it, and it kind of dials back from that dependence on kind of social information and social what's the word? It has to do with our own experience rather than hearsay. Let me put it that way. I think most of the way that most people get information is sort of by osmosis, through kind of social osmosis. We all tend naturally to believe about the world and about capitalism and about religion what other people believe, not necessarily any one person, but there's just sort of the they, right? There's the social, and autistic people are not that keyed into that. we're just not tuned into that channel all that well. It's sort of, we hear it, but it's sort of fuzzy, right? So we have to get to that information through our own direct experience, and that's what the deck is for. I would say that it's a way of clarifying and tuning into your own experience. It's a language rather than a doctrine. So yeah, that's on the website. The blog's on the website. I'm going to set up a way that you can order the draft version of the deck. So I have like kind of a homemade, I guess, version of the deck that I have one publisher produce the book, and I have another publisher produce the cards, and I have some, I get the dice from elsewhere, and I sort of put it together, and I can be sending those out if people want to order it on a deck. And then the more professional grade deck, I guess, will be available on Kickstarter within the year. It's really hard to say how long that's going to take, but between 6 months and a year is realistically, I think, how long it's going to take. And so if you go to that website, empyreanproject.com, you can also get on, just give me your email and you'll be on my mailing list. And I pretty much don't use that mailing list for anything other than I will let you know when the Kickstarter is launched. That's pretty much all I'm going to do with that. And so that will give you the opportunity to buy 2 different versions of the deck, one that's optimized for the gameplay, the cooperative game, one that's optimized that has better actual artwork for tarot style readings. So you'd be able to get like, very just one deck or the whole package. You have the whole kind of spectrum. So if you want me to let you know when that's ready and available, just drop me your email.
Excellent. And as always, all of the aforementioned links will be in the show notes and the video description. Asher, thank you so much for being a part of the Smiling Human podcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed our conversation today.
Me too. Thanks so much for having me.
And that concludes this episode of the Smiling Human podcast. Thank you so much for listening. But before you go, I have 2 invitations for you. The first invitation is to receive a free gift. I've created a free insight journal. This is a 30-day self-reflection and introspection journal that you can download at no cost in the description below. Go have a look and join the journey. The second invitation I have for you is, if it feels within your means and possible for you, then please head over to patreon.com/thesmilinghuman. Becoming a patron will give you access to perks like behind-the-scenes footage and access to live Q&As with me monthly. You also get voting privileges to help pick new guests or to help guide other episode content. Truly, the support of listeners like you, paid or unpaid, goes a long way. So if you can share, subscribe, and give a rating on the podcast app, all of that goes a long way. Thank you to each and every one of you who's been on this journey with me. See you again soon.